Hey everyone, Nick Marzinski here at TrappingLight.com. In my last video, I discussed the histogram, this graph up here in the upper right-hand corner that provides a graphical representation of the tonal values in an image. And that was in anticipation of what I'm going to cover in this tutorial, which is the tone section in the basic panel of Lightroom's Develop module. So I'm in Lightroom, I'm in the Develop module. This is the basic panel, it's the very first tab up here. And previously we talked about white balance. This time we're going to be talking about this section of the basic panel, this tone section. Okay, and we've got 6 sliders here from top to bottom: exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. Okay, now with the exception of contrast, this slider here, which is more of a global adjustment, each of the other 5 sliders provides a rather localized way to adjust the brightness of the image. And when I say localized, what I mean is that these 5 sliders work their magic on very specific parts of the histogram. And the way to tell which section they work on is to simply mouse over each slider, okay, and see the section of the histogram that turns a lighter shade of gray. So if you're looking up here at the histogram, here I'm mousing over the top of it, and you can see what each slider is going to affect. Okay, and what this means is that if we want to make adjustments just to a section of the histogram, we've got an easy way of finding out which sliders we need to use. So for example, if I want to make an adjustment to the very brightest portions of an image, let's say I know that I need to be working with this highlight slider, which affects this top section of the histogram up here, or the white slider, which affects the other section. And if I mouse over the top of the histogram, you can also see that the sections light up and the corresponding slider names here also light up. So it's very easy for you to tell which slider you need to use depending on which section of the histogram you are working with. In this case, I'm working with these top 2 sections for brightness. I want to adjust the highlights and the whites. Okay, and if we work with these sliders, we can see that moving them to the right brightens the image, and I'll move the white slider and you can really see what happens. And moving it to the left darkens the image. Okay, but the important thing to notice here is that these adjustments, this adjustment that I'm making to the highlights section, and if you look at the histogram you can see what's going on, these adjustments are only working on the brightest sections of the image. So the background, the darker section of the image, isn't being affected at all. And this kind of ability to localize your edits for brightness to the highlights or the whites or the shadows is pretty great, because look, if we were making these adjustments in Photoshop, in the regular version of Photoshop or in Photoshop Elements, we'd probably have to apply a layer mask to get this kind of local adjustment. Here, Lightroom automatically restricts our adjustments without us having to apply any selection to the image. So if you don't think that's pretty cool, that I can just make a brightness adjustment just to my highlights or just to my whites or just to my shadows, simply by changing the slider I'm using, if you don't think that's pretty cool, then, you know, I'm sorry, but there's really something wrong with you. So now let's say if instead of working on the brightest sections of the image, we want to work on the darker portions. Okay, well, before it was working with this highlights and this white section. Now, if we want to work with the darker portions, it's just simply working with the shadows and with the blacks. And again, you can see that dragging the slider over to the left is going to darken that section that we're working on, and dragging it to the right is going to brighten it. But again, those settings are localized. So I'm changing the darkest values, but it's not affecting these flowers here. Oh, let me just zoom back out. These flowers here with this adjustment. So again, everything is localized. So we've got these 4 sliders: this highlights, the whites, and the shadows and the blacks that go together. There's also this exposure slider up here on the top. And if we look at it on the area of the histogram that it affects, it appears to affect the midtones. But that's not really telling the whole story, because it affects the midtones, this slider has the ability to actually drag the entire histogram to the left to make it darker, or the right to make it brighter. And so you can see that by dragging it, I'm actually, even though it says, hey, I only affect the midtones, it's actually pretty much used to drag the entire histogram one way or another. Okay? And so for many images, you can actually drag it in 5 stops to the left, which pretty much makes everything except for the very brightest portions almost black, or 5 stops to the right, which pretty much blows out the entire image. So you've got a lot of variation that you can make here to adjust the overall tonal range, the overall brightness of your image. And then finally, there's contrast. And in my last tutorial, I said that exposure and brightness moves the whole histogram from one side to the other. So over to the right or over to the left. Contrast, in contrast, has the effect of pushing the histogram away from this center section here and out towards the edges. So if I move this to the right, it increases contrast, and you can see that the histogram is getting pushed out to the edges. If I move it the other way, that reduces the amount of contrast, and you can see that the histogram gets pushed towards the center and the image starts to get this washed out sort of look. Okay? And so now that's all. We've gone over all the sliders, but there's a few more things that I want to talk about. And the first thing is that if you double click on any of these buttons here, it has the effect of moving the slider back to its center position. So if I double click on contrast, contrast goes back to 0. Same thing with whites or shadows or any of the sliders here. If I want to reset all of them, so if I want to reset everything, just start over with a clean slate, exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, reset all these sliders, I just double click on tone, and it brings everything in this section here back to 0. My white balance isn't changed at all, so I can do this and double click on tone. My white balance stays the same, but everything in this tonal section here will be affected by double clicking on tone. So that's a really great shortcut to get everything back to center if you try some adjustments and it's just not working out for you. Okay, so great. We know what the sliders do, but how should we be using them in our image? Well, in my case with my images, the way that I usually start out is by establishing a white point and a black point in my image. When I'm talking about a white point, what I mean is that I want a point, a very small portion of my image that's white, that's completely white. And by white, I mean it's white, there's no detail. At the same time, I also want a portion of my image that's black. That means absolute black, black with no detail. Okay, and the reason why I want that is because if I've got both of those, then I've got values across the entire range of the histogram. So I've got a lot of contrast. By making sure that I've got a white point and a black point, I introduce additional contrast. So I make the image punchier. I make the image look more interesting and exciting and not as flat. Okay, so that's where I start out, is by establishing my white point and my black point. And if you've been paying attention, probably you're thinking, okay, the easiest way to do that is to use this whites and this blacks slider. And you're right. That's generally where I start out. They say in a lot of the training, hey, you can use this and go from top to bottom. Generally, I don't. In this case, I start at the bottom and then go back up to the top and then work my way down. So what I'm looking for from a histogram kind of perspective, this is where everything is zeroed out. What I'm wanting to get a white point. I want a part of my histogram to just touch the absolute right-hand side of the boundary here. To get my black point, I want another part of my histogram to just barely touch this area here. And I don't want it to do more than barely touch, because if I do that, then I'm losing detail. I want a white point, but I don't want too much white, because otherwise I'm sacrificing detail in my image, and I don't want to do that. So I can just start out with these whites and black sliders and move them until I can kind of eyeball it and see where I've got, maybe I've got something there. I don't know, kind of, sort of, but it's a little tough to tell exactly when it's hitting the left section of the histogram just by moving the sliders. And fortunately, there's a better way to do it. Okay? If I start dragging the slider and hold down the Alt or Option key, what it does in the case of whites is it turns the entire screen black. The entire image right here black. This is Lightroom's way of telling me, okay, you don't have any pure white points in your image yet. Everything is below that. If I start dragging it to the left, you can start to see that color starts to come into that black area. And that's Lightroom's way of telling me, okay, you're introducing clipping, you're introducing white, and up on the top of the histogram you can see that stuff is getting dragged all the way over to the left. If I let go of the option button, you can see what happens when I drag it all the way over. I've got my white point, there's a lot of areas that are white here, but these washed out areas of the image, I don't have any detail, and that's not good either. So when I'm dragging my white point over, what I'm going to do is I'm just holding down the Alt key and dragging until I just get a little bit of color. And that's probably about enough. And now I've got my white point. Up on the histogram, you can also see that there's this triangle here on the right hand side, and right now it's turned blue. I can actually get it to turn white if I drag it just a little bit further. There we go. Now it's white. And this is Lightroom's way of telling me, okay, you've got some areas over here on the absolute right hand side. If I hover over this or click on it, if I click on it, it turns it on. You can see where these red areas are. That means that it's white with no detail. So in this case, I'm probably going to want to bring it back just a little bit. And there we go. Having a little bit is okay. Having too much is not. So now I'm going to do the same thing with the blacks, only in reverse. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and this turns my image white. But now I'm just dragging the blacks over to the left and looking for a case where I start to get some color. And you can see a little bit of yellow in the upper right-hand section of the image. That's Photoshop's way of telling me that I've got some black clipping there. Okay, so now it's clipping in this section of the image right here. And you can see that it's yellow. And what that means is that I'm getting black clipping in the yellow tones of my image. So that's why you see those colors. In this case, you see, if I click on whites, you can see some blue. That's Photoshop's way of telling me that I've got clipping in my blue channel of my image. So that's what those colors mean when you see them in those masks. So I've set my white point and I've set my black point. At this point, I've got a histogram that stretches all the way across the entire gamut of tones, which is what I want. And so now it's time for me to manipulate the overall brightness of my image. What I'm doing now is I'm heading up to the exposure slider and I'm getting it to where I'm happy with the overall brightness. So I'm just sort of dragging it just a little bit. And I usually don't have to drag it too much in this case because the image is already pretty much properly exposed. So I don't have to drag it too much, and I just want to brighten it up maybe just a little bit. I think that's probably okay. I don't want to go much brighter than that. So really very, very small, minute adjustments to exposure in this case. Sometimes I really have to drag it in this case because it's pretty well exposed with my white points and my black points set. I don't have that much work to do on exposure. Okay, after that, I'm adjusting my highlights and my shadows. So I'm just dragging this and looking at what it does. Now in this case, I want to emphasize the water drops that are on these flowers. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to drag my highlights down a bit because it makes it not quite as bright on the image. And that helps sell the water drops that are on this image here. Okay. In this case, I can also continue to hold down the Alt key, and this will show me if I'm getting any additional clipping. So if I drag it all the way over, or sometimes I can introduce additional clipping to the white points in my image. But that just provides me an additional check to make sure that I'm not wrecking what I set with my white and black point sliders here earlier. Now it's on to shadows. Now in this image, shadows primarily affects the background. So if I want to darken the background and really get it out of the way, then I can just drag this all the way over. But you can see when I'm doing that, I'm introducing clipping here. So I want to just walk it back a bit and just introduce a little bit of darkness just to emphasize the flowers here. Maybe I'll darken the highlights just a little bit. How's my white point doing? Okay, great. All that's done. Now it's just providing a little boost to contrast just to make the image pop just a little bit. Now I can drag it all the way over, but that's way too much contrast for me. So it's just making it pop just a bit. And that's pretty much it for this image in terms of adjusting tone. If I press the backslash key, it shows me my before and after. So this is before and this is after. You can see that the image is more dynamic. It's much more interesting because it appears less washed out. We've set the tones to just make the image that much bolder. So now let me do one more just to show you how quick and easy it is, because I really talked through things when I did them. In this case, I'm just going to really move pretty quick. So in this case, it's setting a white point, setting a black point. There we go. Actually, I'll dial that back just a little bit. Okay, up to exposure. Brighten it up just a little bit. And then my highlights. My shadows. and my contrast. There we go, before and after. Took me probably about 20 seconds to do that. So being able to manipulate stuff with these tone sliders, it makes editing really, really quick and easy to get an image that is much, much better than what you started out with, particularly if you're taking raw images where the camera isn't already introducing contrast into the image. This is a really great section of Lightroom to use to get your images to just take that next step from being pretty good to being really, really great. So that's it for now. In the next tutorial, I'm going to move down from the tone section and start talking about the presence section of the basic panel, because now we've adjusted the brightness values of our image, and so now we need to start thinking about making changes to the color values of our image, and there's a lot that we can do there as well. If you have any questions or comments about what you saw in today's tutorial, you can either leave them in my comment section of the YouTube channel or over at my blog at trappinglight.com. Hope you learned something about how to process your images using the tone section of this tutorial, and as always, thanks for watching.